Hello, everyone. I'm Shen Hou. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay, I guess so. So I'm Shen Hou. I'm an environmental historian from Renmin University of China. But here is I'm the moderator of this panel, and welcome to our panel, the Non-Human Himalaya, from our webinar series, the geopolitics and ecology of melting mountains. Here is a note for you, and if you have questions, please leave questions for the panel in the Q&A box, and we will take two to three questions towards the end of the panel. So when we think about the Himalaya, and we think about these grand mountains and the formidable mountain peaks, and we think about all those great rivers running into the whole Asia. But to what extent we really think about the non-human world in these mountains? And so this would be the main question for our panelists to discuss today. And so we have three fabulous panelists from different parts of the world. And so I would like them, Charles, Dan, and Shailee, to introduce themselves and to tell us how they are drawn into this place, and how they find these places so interesting. So shall we start with Charles? Charles, can you hear me? Charles?
I've unmuted, okay?
Oh yeah, now it's fine.
Okay. Hi everyone. So my name's Charles Siebert. I'm a poet and a journalist and an author, and I also teach at NYU Abu Dhabi, creative writing. I write, by and large, over the last 20 years, especially about non-humans and the often fraught relationship between humans and non-humans, but sometimes fruitful relationships as well. I write, I'm interested in all aspects of the so-called natural world, and I include cities within that designation. But with the Himalayas, I have a particular focus on elephants, the Indian elephant, Asian elephant, and their plight all over the world, but especially with regard to the Himalayas, to which now, like people, the elephants are retreating for water, for refuge. So they've become a kind of parallel refugees. And the question I'm fascinated by is how can human and non-human inhabitants who seek out this melting mountains, how can they coexist, and how can that be a totem for the larger world in terms of how to coexist with the non-human? So that's one angle on my concern and interest in the area.
Thanks a lot, Charles. And Dan?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Lewis. I'm a curator at a big research library in Southern California here, where it's very early in the morning. And I oversee a large body of science, medicine, technology materials, but I'm an environmental historian, one of the faculty at Caltech here in Pasadena. And I'm really interested as well, of course, in the non-human and in birds in particular. They've been the focus of my last two books, although I'm writing a new book about trees to avoid being typecast as a bird person entirely. But I think you can't really talk about the non-human without talking about the human, of course, as Charles said or implied. And I think it's those dynamics and those accommodations that become really crucial. And I think it's also true that I think there's a strong conservation bent. If you're interested in ecology and in the environment, there's a sort of a built-in notion that there's an activist flavor to being interested in the natural world and in the non-human world. So there's lots of fruitful things to talk about that relate to the Himalayas and to its populations along those lines.
Okay, so let's move to Shailee.
Hi everyone, I'm Shailee Basnet, and I'm from Nepal, Kathmandu. So a lot of times when you think of Nepal, you of course think of the Himalayas, and that's my connection. Being a Nepali, we're super proud that we're home to Everest and some of the biggest mountains in the world. So that's been my connection. But to be very honest, growing up in Kathmandu, which is the capital of Nepal, apart from that pride associated, there was not much understanding of what really the Himalayas mean and the significance. I was very fortunate to be able to join a female expedition to Mount Everest in the year 2008. We're a team of 10 women, and it's a completely separate story, but you know, because we're young, petite, all of that, we faced a lot of socio-economic challenges, people not believing us, all of that. But by the end of this mission, all 10 of us from the team were able to climb Everest, and we became the largest and most successful women's team to be on Everest. So that's how I got close to the Himalayas. Climbing is literally probably the closest you can get to the Himalayas. And when you go there, when you firsthand live and breathe on that space, you realize that this has way more significance than just reading in textbook that, yay, we are the proud inhabitants of the Himalayas. So that's been my connection, and I'm very happy to share my experiences with all of you. I'm not an expert, I'm not an academic, but I do have some interesting things to share, which I heard, I saw, and I've experienced in the Himalayas.
Yeah,
I just want to interject. I just want to interject to say that Shailee, you people, she's totally the bomb, because she didn't say, but she's not just summited Everest, but she's summited all 7 of the continental peaks on the planet, which is absolutely astonishing feat. If you know anything about mountaineering, even if you don't, just wanted to say a
I
little
just
shout out.
cannot imagine that just a minute ago I was talking about not be able to getting up in the morning to go jogging, and here we have somebody who climbed all of the mountains. And so yeah, but I noticed that all of us, we are very interested in the Himalayas, but we also want to connect the Himalayas with a much larger world. So I just wonder that what kind of message, when we talk about the non-human world of the Himalayas, it can really, what kind of messages we can really tell the larger world in terms of our, problematic relationship between humans and the rest of nature and the non-human world. What kind of messages can we take from this non-human world of Himalayas, to tell the rest of the world? How can we connect the non-human world of Himalayas with the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, there's some extensible ideas, there are all kinds of ways to reach out to broader ideas. I mean, so habitat matters, I think, is probably one way to put it. You put it in a kind of a biological frame, habitat matters. And so the particulars of a place, its geography, its climate, its riparian scenarios, its weather, all really are impactful to animals. And as a result, the ways that they go into decline and that they go extinct, in fact, are really directly related to the kinds of anthropomorphic changes that we've pressed upon the world. And so the fact that we change a river pattern in the Himalayas or somewhere else, the fact that we modify not just a global climate, but a localized climate, can have a dramatic effect on the residents. So I think for me, one of the takeaways is simply that the fact that you can't get away from the outside world, in a sense. You can't get away from the environment when it comes to the ways these things impact organisms everywhere. And so it's easy to sort of ignore human causality, because if you're not seeing it, and when you're out in the mountains or you're out anywhere out of doors, you get a chance to really see the direct effects of the natural world on its residents, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you have something to say?
No, it's not like we want to sublimate or make an icon of one place, but the Himalayas are a kind of iconic habitat, as Dan refers to it. So it should be in that way looked at as a totem for how we might manage the world going forward. And we don't manage it at all, but we think we do. And You know, in a way, you know, the non-human Himalayas seems to be a marginalized like subset of a larger conversation. It in fact is the larger conversation, and we are the small presence, even though it doesn't seem that way. But the more we come to see ourselves as that, as a part of a big web, and maybe the Himalayas can help teach us that, then the world beyond the Himalayas will be better managed. And you know, the question becomes again and again, especially with a large fellow land inhabitant like the elephant, is, you know, are we just going to shove them away and live without them, or is there a means of coexistence and convergence in a way? And that's very hard to do with elephants. I wrote and came to know very closely a man named Alan Rabinowitz, who grew up right around the block from me, it turns out, in Brooklyn, New York. But he ended up establishing the world's first jaguar reserve in Belize. But years later, he realized that, you know, it wasn't just about fencing off one part of Belize for jaguars. If you do that, you cut off all their vitality genetically. He found out that jaguars migrate from the Mexican border all the way down to Patagonia and mix and match with other jaguars. So he, before he passed away last year, he managed to get all the governments in Central and South America to cooperate to leave a corridor open that Alan called the Jaguar Highway, so that jaguars can move in and around human development. And, you know, something like that is harder to implement with elephants, but it's actually being done. There's a scientist or conservationist in India who's actually got an SMS signaling system going to alert people to where the elephants are. And this reduces, so they can get out of the way, and it reduces human-elephant conflict, which is becoming ever more a problem because, you know, they have their ways and migratory routes, and we have our ever expanding encroachment upon those routes. So can we abnegate ourselves or abstain and modify ourselves? Because if we don't, it'll be the end of creatures like elephants, but it'll also be the end of us in a sense, because it'll just be reckless, constant expansion and encroachment and degradation of habitat. So that's a way in which the Himalayas can be a wonderful kind of model and test case for how we go forward.
Yeah, I really like the whole idea of, you know, not making the Himalaya kind of icon. Of course, it is an icon, but actually it's also one of the places on the world. But also like what you just said, it's actually we need to think about E.O. Wilson's, you know, teaching about rewilding the whole world, half of the earth, making it a total different world. But let's say, you know, Shailee, you are really from the mountains, you are really from the region. So what do you think?
So a lot has been going on in the Himalayas. Sorry.
Excuse me.
Yeah. So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. The voice is a little bit delayed. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So there's a lot going on in the Himalayas, and you know, as a child, what I learned about the mountains, the Himalayan mountains, is that they're permanent snow cover, and that's like, you think of going to the mountains, you want to see this permanent snow and ice cover. When we were going up on Everest, I remember around the second camp, you don't see the summit of Everest from the base camp and first camp, you have to go really high. So second camp is where it's 6,000 meters, and you then see the whole, you know, face of Everest. And it was super dark. There was no snow or ice cover. It's also because that section is steep, but people who had been climbing Everest for many years, maybe they had climbed like 10 times already. We had a cook at Camp 2, and his joke was, he used to joke that, you know, in the future, he's gonna organize a painting expedition for Everest so that it stays white. So these are things, and they are not experts, and he's a cook, but he's been there probably more than any expert. And if we look at the science part of it, there's a wonderful organization called EC Mode and a lot of other organizations studying the Himalayas. And I worked as a journalist, so, you know, I read about this report from, I think, Columbia University, which said that between 2000 to 2016, Himalayas have lost something like 1.5 feet of vertical ice. And that's scary. But because it's been permanent ice cover for I don't know how many years, we don't notice it when we go there maybe for the first time. But if you've been there, you know, for a decade or more, then the local people can see that difference. So yes, the Himalayas are iconic and everything. It's still beautiful to go watch. It's still amazing to go climb. But the Himalayas are already speaking. And they are probably one of the most fragile part of our system. And that's why they're more iconic. It might take more time for maybe other reasons, or the impact might be slightly different. If you just want to know what happens when we don't control some of our behavior, when global warming becomes real, you can just take a look at the Himalayas. If you can see 1.5 feet of snow disappear, you know something is going on. Charles here is an elephant expert, and I want to share with everybody here, especially also Charles, is that the joke on Everest is that, you know, every passing year, now tomatoes are growing higher in the Himalayas because it's getting warmer. You know, thatch roofs are becoming a problem now because more than snow, it's rain. So these little things are affecting people already. And so the joke is that one day it won't be too far in the future when mosquitoes and elephants will start climbing Everest, because it's just getting warmer and warmer. So these impacts are real. I've heard people say from the reason that earlier the glacial streams used to flow around May, and now it's around April. So people are feeling it. Experts are already establishing that. So the relationship of Himalayas to the rest of the world is, if you want to know what can happen, just see. There have been Gulf bursts already. There have been damages, destructions already. Some studies said that Gulf lakes were able to push like 6 meters diameters rock. So they call it Himalayan tsunami. Can you imagine like these big rock rivers flowing down villages and all? They're moving villages so that they're out of the stream's way. So the impact is real, and I think that's where the big connection lies for the rest of the world.
Okay, yeah. When you ask us to imagine that the coexistence of mosquitoes and elephants in the Himalayas, so that's really a picture. So, but you know, we all are talking about some kind of moral sense, moral applications we have for the non-human world of the Himalayas. So I wonder that, because you know, sometime that people blame that environmentalists are ecocentric and as a kind of, you know, tree huggers or elephant lovers. And I wonder that what kind of moral message we really want to pass on to the rest of the world when we are talking about the non-human world of the Himalayas.
You know, it's really interesting. Getting people to pay attention and take responsibility for the natural world is a challenge, because, you know, so for so many people it's an abstraction. And, you know, I mean, you get to in a place like the Himalayas where, I mean, humans have already pressed their hand on the scale in a way that you can't deny, and you really can't now find a way to imagine a world. I think it's, perhaps this is a little cynical, but it's hard to imagine a world where there isn't sort of an inevitable human set of circumstances or involvement, even if they're indirect. So for things like the changing climate. So given that, we've got to sort of find a way to think forward. But in a place like the Himalayas, so you know, one of the great questions anywhere is how to protect biodiversity while you still can meet developmental needs, because it's impossible to ignore the fact that humans need places to live. They need either subsistence agriculture or more capitalist forms of support. And in some ways, that's a hard thing to overturn. And so in a place like the Himalayas, it's, for instance, the higher up you go, the less development there is, right? So no one's building structures at 15,000 feet, or well, that's not probably true. At 18,000 feet, no one's building habitable year-round structures. And so you get to see what it's like for things to change without that sort of imprint. So climate starts changing, and you start paying attention to other sort of influence vectors, you know, things that are different. So the fact that mosquitoes, as climate warms, the mosquito vector gets higher and higher and higher. And of course, mosquitoes carry all sorts of things, avian pox, avian malaria, that they can then transmit to other species. So there's a sort of an indirect result of this sort of development, but they're sort of a great laboratory because you get to see what it's like at high elevations when humans aren't necessarily doing the stereotypical things that humans do, which is, you know, razing forest lands or destroying habitat very actively. But you still yet you still see the effect of these global activities on everywhere at high elevation included.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, you talked about this conservation, you know, conservation codes. I mean that when we are talking about conservation today, certainly that we don't mean conservation during the time period of Ted Roosevelt or even John Muir. So what kind of conservation do you think that we should actually work on these days?
Well, you know, there are very practical things to be done. So, you know, restoring riparian environments in the region is I speak about the birds, you know, that's a great way to sort of foster and protect avian biodiversity, and the fact that if you have a reliable water supply, you know, everyone needs H2O, you know, and so if you have a way to have a reliable source, and you can actually restore. It's not just about keeping things intact. Sometimes the hand of humans has to work to kind of counteract the damage we've already done. So restoring, you know, riparian environments is one particularly useful thing to do in the mountains for everything that relies on water, from the very tiny to the very large. I mean, elephants have to drink, right, Charles? So, you know, and have to have a clean water supply. I read some horrifying thing a couple of days ago about elephant poaching, I think in Africa, where the way they kill them is they put cyanide in the water. And then they'll come to the watering hole, drink, and then they'll die in large numbers. And so I think paying attention to the things that we can restore becomes a really important sort of remediation and a way of doing penance, perhaps, for our you know, our actions.
Yeah. So Charles, what do you think?
I'm afraid Shailee's joke is coming true. The elephants are. In fact, I used the term refugee before because they're leaving their quote unquote natural habitat and natural migratory routes for the very simple reason that they, like us, need water, and they're escaping drought-stricken lands, and so they're having to establish new routes, and that's very parallel to what humans are having to do. And the reason why a species like elephants, like I don't want to prioritize them, but they are so, when you come to know them and their ways and their sophistication and their complexities and their family structure and their societal structure, and the horrible ways that their culture breaks down under too much stress, usually human caused, are also parallel to the way human society and culture breaks down under stress, under improper parenting, the breakup of family units, no matter how they're defined today. All the same stressors, but also all the same kind of reinforcements that we get through our societal structures, elephants do. And elephants also wound psychically the way humans wound, but they heal too through therapy, and are the most resilient species, one of the most resilient species, despite all that happens to them on the earth. So, you know, it becomes, you asked about morals before, who are we as a being if we continue to fail to see this fellow intelligence? You know, humans, I say humans are a species that suffers from a misdirected gaze. You know, we look heavenward for all our big answers, and we look skyward for alien intelligences, and they've been right beside us all along. And it's sickening about us that we only come to understand that by the ways we destroy creatures, so whales and elephants, and we it's like we don't know what we had until we see the way it breaks down. So is there a way we can stop doing that? And elephants, in that way, I would be really happy if they became a totemic species, because they would then take us to that other moral place. That's the thing about elephants, you know, they're the most revered and most reviled creature on the earth. I mean, you can't have a creature that's been more mythologized, but at the same time more marred. In the case of the Asian elephant, so many are used to, you know, fight our wars and to shepherd tourists around, you know, under the Ankish wielded by mahouts. And people don't realize when they go on those little tourist outings that that elephant they're riding on the back of had to be beaten to within an inch of its life to learn how to be that docile and controllable. So as Dan was saying, and Shailee, I mean, it's about alerting. We have to find ways to alert people to these other parallel minds and the fact that they have minds. So it goes to, and that they're individuals. So it goes to this mantra I always say to myself in my writing, you know, one of my consistent themes is the inability of humans to see ourselves as animals and to see animals as themselves, as individuals, creatures outside of the confines of our myth making and our allegories and story making. You know, they're individuals, and it's a moral responsibility to regard them as such.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Aldo Leopold said. It took 19 centuries for human beings to develop a certain decent ethics towards each other. So it might take another 19 centuries for us to really develop some kind of decent ethics towards other species. Yeah, I totally agree with you. So let's say, Shailee, would you like to, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Charles and what he said about the elephants. Probably Himalayas could be looked at in the same way, also highly revered. Even when we go there, like you could be from any faith, any religion, and I can see people just stepping into the Himalayas and they say things like they feel closer to the gods, and you know, along the way you see these prayers and, you know, chants everywhere. It's a very spiritual experience. And even before we climb Everest or any mountain for that matter, there's actually a worshiping ceremony. And this time we worship the mountains. We seek permission from Everest before we step onto the higher slope. So there is very high regard for the mountains. And when I was on the summit of Everest, I was really blown away because I could see the whole world below me. And I was I had a lot of respect for, you know, people in the region who knew Himalayas were special even before anybody climbed them. For hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, they know how special it has been. We know, I'm part of that community in a sense. So Himalayas are very, you know, when I was on the mountains, I really felt for the first time in my life that there is no distinction between me as a human being and the outside nature. In the Himalayas, I learned that we are process and product of nature. We are one. It's not different. You know, we breathe that air, that water feeds us. So it's one and the same. And again, going back to what I've seen and what I've read, the people, there's this famous climber, Apa Sherpa, who held the world record for climbing Everest the most number of times back in the day. And he was on the mountain the same year we climbed also. And he was sharing with us that he saw a little bit of running water at the highest camp at 8,000 meters for the first time in the year 2008. And he had not seen that before. And again, yes, it's anecdotal, but a lot of people are saying it. And at the same time, the science also supports these things. There are more glacial lakes being formed. That is one of the biggest threats in the Himalayas. So what can we do? The answer, I think, is pretty obvious. It's out there. We got to reduce our carbon emission. There's no doubt about it. But locally also, our air pollutants, all kinds of pollution is so high. It does affect the Himalayas. It's been established. So we got to work on that. But at the same time, the local the one beautiful thing I've seen in the Rolwaling region, which is home to Chorolpa, which is a big glacial lake. There's been a lot of work done towards it. They've managed a sensor for warning. They have managed controlled drainage so that it does not burst one day. The same they're doing in the Everest region in the Imja Lake. When I climbed that mountain island peak, which is also called Imjatse, you look down and you see this beautiful turquoise lake. You know, it looks so beautiful, but when you understand the reality and when you see the pictures of how small that lake used to be and how much it has grown in these years, then you get the sense of dread. But there have been studies, there have been work, they're draining it properly so that there's no such outburst. But there are way more of those lakes. So what we need to do is a combination of local knowledge, what the science tells us, where we have arrived technology-wise, where we can actually even control these big lakes. So a combination of things from very local to, big global pacts, where we all, big countries especially, but everybody agrees that, okay, enough is enough. We got to change our ways. So the answer, I think, to how to conserve, how to go about it, lies from the very micro, small, local to global level of efforts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Go ahead,
I just want to say, I think it's really important to leaven our sense of anxiety and dread, as Shailee said, about the environment with a sense of hope. And I think there's a way to think about that. I teach a history of extinction class at Caltech. I'm right in the middle of it right now. And so students are like, we're screwed. What are we supposed to do about all this species decline and so on? And so one of the things that's true is the closer you scrutinize species large and small everywhere is that you start to discover new ones. Mm-hmm. So you make discoveries about species that are previously unknown to science. And Charles, I wanted to ask you about something. So I just read this last week. I don't know if you've come across this bit of news so for the first time, elephants have been spotted in the middle Himalayas of Uttarakhand. They were spotted by drones, and apparently it's extremely rare for them to be seen in the upper regions of the mountains. Speaking of elephants climbing mountains, but so they've for better and perhaps for worse, they pushed into new habitat, but they clearly have found a way to exploit these sort of hilly terrains, which is hard for them to do. But so I was fascinated to see that they had done that, and I don't know if it was perhaps out of desperation or perhaps it was out of just plain animal opportunism, and so I was curious about that and what that might mean.
Yeah, that's why I use that word. Well, it's certainly opportunistic, but desperate also. I mean, they're just out of water in their more southern climes, and they're therefore climbing up and making new habitat. That's very much analogous to and parallel to what's happening with human beings, even as the mountains are melting. So it's just that it's why we need to observe what they're doing in a way to monitor, I guess, the moment and how to, as Shailee put it, it all should be, yes, we're talking about the Himalayas now, but it all should be local application of proper ethics and control, and then let that speak to the larger. If that happened in pockets everywhere, that might help begin to make this necessary change. And as Shailee was talking about point of view, I know everyone's thought this, but I've been writing this in this novel I'm writing about, which happens to be about viruses and not a negative book about them. It's in fact, it's a book that it's a novel, but it ends up pointing up the fact that we wouldn't be besieged by this one virus right now if it weren't for viruses in the first place, because they are not just parasitic, they're generative if you go way back in time. But there's this way in which we just have to know that larger web of interconnectivity and take the view that the virus is now giving us. This is where I was going with this. So they say in northern India now finally people can see the Himalayas again because the skies have cleared. People are seeing the bottom of the Seine and the bottom of the canals in Venice, and you know, the virus is forcing the kind of human retreat or surcease that may be edifying to us in a way. If we, you know, I sometimes, you talk about this class about extinction and the dread, but maybe there is something to be positive from this forced pause. The elephant, I mean, the whales, yeah. the waterbound elephants of the world can hear each other's songs again because there's less clamor from boats. You know, those ancient song lines. And so, you know, I don't know if that'll change us or give us more perspective. I hope on my more positive days, I hope that something can be taken from that. But
yeah, sometimes that we still need hope. But here, because you know, we are all talking about the non-human world. So Charles, you are talking about elephants, and Dan, you are talking about birds, and then Shailee, you are really talking about mountains. So what do we really mean by non-human world? Because, you know, Charles, you keeps reminding us that we are part of nature, and there is this interconnectedness, and we actually are as vulnerable to all kinds of virus and all kinds of other natural disasters, natural risks, just as all the other animals. And we need as much as they do in terms of our physical needs. So when we're talking about the non-human world, are we really talking about different species, different than us? Or are we really talking about this, the health of the ecosystem or ecosphere even? You know, what are we really talking about at this point?
I almost resist the word non-human anymore. I just the world. I mean, it's, we're such, you know, we need to be knocked off our pedestal of self-importance, and Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, uses a phrase that humans live by this sky hook, that, you know, we somehow hover above nature, and we're anointed and apart. And, you know, we're just such a little speck of dust on the mote of all biology. And I just, you know, I just wish we could just blur all these, you know, all these distinctions and understand, you know, that the way they go we, you know, that this just isn't, this isn't a fashion to say that you're, you know, want to protect an elephant or a bird species. It's about protecting the future of, you know, you know, we're not going to be here all that long overall, but it's how we want it to be and how we hope to manage it. You know, we are, look, there's an epoch named after us. That might be human hubris, but the Anthropocene is the first epoch named after us rather than rocks. So, you know, so we are.
I always have some such suspicion about the Anthropocene.
Yeah. I mean, so we're clearly special. We're dominant. We're doing unprecedented things, but we ain't that special that, you know, we aren't frail and as frail and breakable and finite as all the other species we share the earth with. So we got to get used to it. You know, we have to see it. Feel it.
Yeah, Charles, I'm with you with this idea of sort of eliminating this idea of non-human altogether, because starting with the fact that our biome, our own biome, and the human gut and the bacteria in it radiate outward, and you know, it becomes a relatively meaningless term to say non-human, and it might be that to break down that sort of terminological barrier would mean that we'd start to think about the world in the same way that we think about ourselves. You know, i.e., we become selfish. We become selfish about the rest of the world in the way that we're selfish about ourselves. Perhaps, you know.
I think that's really right. I often say that, like, we're just an idea that our bacteria are having. You know, they're in the saddle.
Actually,
they're in the saddle and they ride mankind. You know, to borrow Emerson's phrase about things. You know, So yeah, you're exactly right. It's like,
yeah, but on the other hand, we're also talking about those non-living things or the non-organic things. So in what way they are part of this, obviously they are the so-called non-human world. In what way they really influence our human world? Because Shailee, you are mainly talking about the mountains, the lake, the water, even though that they're habitat for all kinds of living things. But you also point out that they are not us. They are different. I still think that we need to address the difference. We cannot say that we are just nature. We can represent nature. Of course, we cannot represent nature. We are part of nature, but there is still some difference. Things we create are different than things nature creates. So do you think that we should still address differences? Shailee?
Yes, the difference, thank you, Shen. When we say non-humans, the obvious answer in my head is definitely, I've been saying it again and again, the mountains. When we started training, our instructors used to tell us that every year the trainees have to be, not every year, but frequently trainees have to be taken higher and higher so that we could be trained on ice. And studies are saying these ice and glacier are melting, so you can see bare rocks. And our instructors would tell us that, the mountains, they're turning from bright like day, they're turning into dark like the night. And that's, we may not think of non-humans as speaking, but that's the mountains. They're speaking out loud. It's not even subtle anymore. When we climb mountains, we always say you could be the most strongest person, you could be the best climber, but you have to listen to the mountains. For instance, when my team was in Denali, it was 19 days expedition, but 10 days, my teammates were just waiting out bad weather. And I know Dan gave me a very great introduction, but just a little correction. I've not climbed all the 7 peaks. I was the leader of the mission, and my team did. So when my team was in Alaska, 10 days, it was just waiting for bad weather. So no matter how adventurous or strong you are, you have to listen to nature, the local weather, what's happening in a larger scale. So the non-human aspect are not quiet, they are speaking, and it's loud and clear when we talk about the mountains turning from day to night. And of course, there are animals, I don't want to go into details. I'm not the right person to do that, but we know what is happening in the animal world too. And even in the microbiome world. Going to what Charles and Dan were saying, yes, of course, humans are, have this, high pedestal for themselves and stuff like that. But one of the experiences I've had, speaking of what our bacteria is making us think, even, for example, let's say lungs. We have this whole notion, mind over matter, if you have it, you can do it. We go with that attitude. But if my lung is not able to cope in that thin air as I keep gaining elevation, then I can't be that arrogant human. I have to listen to my lung. Is my lung a non-human or a human? I am listening to my lung. I'm not
if
listening
you smoke,
to it.
Actually, it's not that, it's non-human.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing to the whole world, just going with my own ideas, but not even listening to parts of my own body that are vital for my own survival. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that's what non-human to me is, from the big giant Himalayas to maybe, little viruses and our lungs and legs. That's what keeps us alive and keeps us going in the mountains.
Yeah, that's this is really interesting because, we environmental historians keep saying that, we try to study the interactions between nature and the culture. And then some environmental historians would argue that everything is just hybridity. And I don't agree with that, because I always feel that hybridity is just the final result. But nature still has its spontaneous power. And that kind of power actually really shapes ourselves and then the so-called non-human world. But so let's get to some Q&A because we get some questions from our audience. And so one of the question actually is still about the damage, the damage that we have done to the Himalayas. So earlier we talked about climate change, and now we are also talking about people's damage to the Himalayas. So I wonder that which impact is stronger, in terms of local or global climate change, or in terms of people's behaviors to the mountains, like cutting down the forests, draining the water. So what kind of impacts you think that most dangerous to the non-human world of the Himalayas? So, yeah.
So I don't really have a sense as to what constitutes development in the Himalayas, and I'm curious about that. I mean, what does it mean to say, and I'd be curious to hear Shailee's perspective about that. What does it mean to say, because that term development is one of those things that is a moving target in terms of saying, because, development in, Tokyo is going to be very different than development in, at 10,000 feet in the Himalayas. And I'm curious about what people's sense is of that term, if that's one way into answering the question.
Yeah, it's I did see somebody ask a question also about trekking in the Himalayas. See, before the world opened up to Himalayas opened up to climbing and expeditions and trekking, it was a remote region where mostly people were poor, were maybe growing potatoes. Cultivation is very low there. And trekking and tourism, this expedition brought major commercial opportunity. So yes, we're talking about the non-humans, but we also cannot forget the fact that people's livelihood depend, the quality of life depend on these commercial activities. So, to answer what is development, we might need a different panel. So to kind of keep it, keeping the time in mind, because Himalayas is probably most heavily involved in the tourism aspect of development. And what do we do about it? On the one hand, I know I have friends who've lost lives because they were on the mountain in the wrong time, avalanche happened or some accident happened, and they were doing that so that they could send their kids to college. They had no other opportunity to make an income. What do we do about that? People keep saying maybe there should be less people on Everest, and it's a valid question, but what do you then do for the livelihood for people who are dependent on it? So there's this balance you have to maintain. In Denali, in Alaska,
the question is how do we really draw the balance between human development and the non-human elements in Denali, in Alaska?
Sorry, Shen, I'm speaking over you. What I learned was they had a cap to how many people could climb Denali in a year, and that was 1,500. And there was it was nowhere near what people were already doing. We have never done such carrying capacity calculation for, I'm not aware if it's been done anywhere in any part of the Himalayas. We don't know what is the right number of people who could trek to Everest Base Camp every year. Is it 50,000? Is it 200,000? Every year, it just keeps increasing. So it's definitely time for us to look at these aspects. One of the solution that I can see as a person from the tourism and mountaineering industry is that, particularly for Nepal, I can say is that we got to diversify our destination. When people think of Nepal, they think of Everest, they think of Annapurna. But above 6,000 meters, we have 1,310 mountains in Nepal alone, from east to west, in the northern Himalayas. So we got to diversify so that there's, yes, also development, but in the sensible, right way in the other regions, so that people don't die of, poverty or small illnesses, so that people have real livelihood opportunity. And then it also reduces stresses from popular destinations like the Everest region and the Annapurna region. So that might be one balance where you kind of, figure out a way to spread it across than to just overburden one place with too much going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our time is running short. So Charles, what
no, I had a question for Shailee about, one of the things what you were saying reminded me of when that reserve was set up in Belize by Alan Rabinowitz, the great conservationist of cats, wild cats. The whole premise of the so-called developed world of United States was, oh, we need the jaguar, the precious jaguar, we can't lose the jaguar. But Alan's point was, well, you don't just go down to a country like Belize and tell them what to do with their land and their, and how to develop it just because you revere and romanticize this one creature. And what Alan did is, he went out of his way to get soil experts in and talk to the government about how this land was really not good for constant regenerative farming, and that more money could be made for the local people through ecotourism. And so I'm wondering, and that model gets repeated over across the world in terms of elephants and other natural habitats. So I'm wondering if the great tourist hiking destination that the Himalayas have become, is that one way of providing necessary income for local people and also preserving the environment, if that's what you were kind of alluding to before.
Yes, I was, and thanks for bringing up that, Charles. Yes, definitely. And again, I want to emphasize that when we speak of Himalayas spread over, I think, 8 countries, and not every region of Himalayas has seen development. Life there is still hard. For the majority part, life is still hard. We've only seen the iconic pictures of the more famous mountains and trails and climbers and all of that. So yes, there has to be a combination of the concept of maybe ecotourism, where people get livelihood, but at the same time, these places are also protected and conserved. I also want to answer this question. I think I saw in the Q&A box from Heather, who mentioned about comedy and conservation in the Himalayas. I'll take this opportunity to quickly say that, and Dan mentioned this right in the beginning, that it's very hard to communicate sometimes about the non-humans. That's a challenge. I read some years ago that the people working for the Antarctic conservation were also struggling to get into people's head, that it's important. So they actually took a tour, took artists on a tour so that they can come up with something to communicate to the masses. And the reason for that, as a comedian, I can tell you, is that it's very easy to crack a joke on politician. It's very easy to crack a joke on, on human, but how do you bring out something about the mountains, So that's why elephants climbing Everest is kind of one of the comedy routine we can use to let the people know what's really happening. I started doing comedy in 2011, and the first script I wrote was on climate change. It's not great at all. Only 2 days ago, I've just launched my online comedy show. I don't know if I should be doing this plug, but I have a comedy show on November 28th. It's called Mount Everest Diaries, and it is actually going to talk about the funny aspect of climbing Everest, but also what's happening in the Himalayas, but in a funny way. It's going to be all jokes. So this person who asked this question, Heather, I'm trying, and maybe you can be the judge of it. So please do come to my show. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Shailee. But we've been talking about local development and how to keep the balance between the two. But here we have the climate change, we have global warming, and we know the mountains are melting. So do you think that with the melting mountains, we can still see some hope there? Dan, what do you think?
I think so. I mean, I think it's all about strategy, right? And there are different strategies that are conservation strategies. Mm-hmm. I think ecotourism is one of the best ways to think about supporting local economies, and at the same time, getting people who have a light footprint on the land. But I get.
But when you think about ecotourism, that means that people have to fly there and have to get all kinds of equipment. That means that will basically emit, more carbon dioxide into the air.
Yeah, I mean, at some point you have to sort of try to evaluate the trade-offs. That's absolutely true. Is there a way to have a carbon neutral version of that somehow? Is there a way to buy carbon offsets and so on? So you don't want to be you want to be thoughtful about how you execute it, a sort of a start to finish, as it were, sort of plan for ecotourism. But in some ways, if you can get people, it's hearts and minds. You got to get people to start thinking about the environment, and one way to do that is to get them to see it and empathize with it, and then radiate that out to their peer groups, and and so you start slowly building this sort of group consciousness about bit by fragmented bit, as it were, about the value of the non-human world, and the fact that, because it's not until you see it, it's just an abstraction until you see it. It really is, and then you see it, and as you know, it's lived experience. It really changes our attitudes about things.
So we either do that or just remain in permanent quarantine.
Yeah, the quarantine, the coyotes are running up and down my street all the time. I have to keep my kids inside. I don't think they could drag down one of my kids at this point.
I spotted many more birds on the campus of Qingdao University during the quarantine. Yeah, but but global warming is something much grander than anything else, and I wonder that whether those kind of strategies, from an individual behavior or even from one nation state would really work. Especially, just like we mentioned earlier, that the Himalayas actually are the mountains shared by several other countries. And what kind of role do you think governments can play in protecting the Himalayas?
What kind of role?
I think.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what kind of role do you think that government, national governments can really play in terms of conserving the non-human world of the Himalayas?
Yeah, at this point, I can what I can see is that there is concern, there is understanding, there is people or the government are not saying it's not happening. Like nobody can ignore it anymore.
Excuse me, just 1 second, Shailee. I just noticed that we are running out of time, so can we just make it really short? Let's just give our final comments, and then we have to wrap it up. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so to wrap up, my understanding is that there's no magic bullet. There's no one thing that's going to solve everything. If that was possible, it would have been done already. So there's going to be a combination of a lot of efforts. Does one person's or one individual or one government's effort count? It would be better if everybody, boarded together, but everything counts. At this point, I think we've made enough damage that at this point, a lot is required, but even if it's a little coming from anywhere, it does matter. It does make a difference. And we cannot discount anything from the local indigenous knowledge. It's very important. You cannot take that apart out at all. It's super important. But as a woman from South Asia, I can also tell you there's a lot of things that don't make sense. Like, I have been through a lot of when, we have our menstrual cycle, we're supposed do not touch anything, this, that. We have, there are also these other aspects. So there needs to be maybe a fresh but respected approach to local knowledge, integration of what the larger scale efforts can do, and some of it is happening already. So again, I like to go back to saying the same thing, that everything counts, and you take in everything from the most local to the most global, both as an effort and as a responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much, Shailee. Let's say what Charles' final comments for this session.
Well, just quickly, I would just say, yeah, I mean, when you asked the question before, what's the overarching issue? It's got to be climate change. So it comes down to can we arrive at a kind of forced cross-world cooperation under the melting caps. I mean, it's pretty simple that way. It's a very broad statement, but yeah, it can't be. It's got to be cooperative. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
And at the risk of sounding like a fan of government overreach, I think you said the word coerce, Charles. I think some government persuasion is a way to get people to do the right thing until you can sort of saturate people's sort of cultural and social norms about taking care of the planet. But I think that's one potential solution, is to just insist that governments insist that we do the right thing. Yeah, because it is the great existential crisis of our time. Yeah, climate change.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank all our three panelists for this very exciting discussion. I've learned a lot from all you guys, and I share the same values you cherish. And I do think that the Earth and the Himalayas need some kind of new moral sense, a kind of moral sense guiding us beyond our own spaces. And that's probably the final hope we can have for this, to prevent these mountains from melting. So there are some notes I want our audience to know. Our team has collected because there are many great questions, but we just cannot answer all of them. So we've already collected all the unanswered questions from the Q&A, and we will aim to address them in our upcoming material and programs. And also, for someone who cannot come to our for this event today, and we will share the recording of today's session with all the registered attendees. But also remember that we have the upcoming panel, Contested Waters, China-India Environmental Politics on the Roof of the World History in half an hour. So, but meanwhile, I want to remind all of us that, please reach out to us through our website if you are interested in our work and would like to collaborate. Thank you very much. I also want to thank all our attendees and for all those great questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Fun. Okay.